ear would hear these sounds. And by spectra, I mean the average spectrum of, let's say, a single note or a sustained sound from the instrument. And people knew a little bit about the attack and decay characteristics. They knew the piano had a sharp attack and a slow decay, and using music 4 and 5, Risset could produce these spectra controllably and accurately, and they didn't sound like the instruments. And what Risset discovered was that it was important to control the attack and decay of each overtone in the spectra independently. I think his initial example was the brass timbre, where he showed that during the build-up of a note, the attack phase, the higher frequency components had to increase faster than the lower frequency components. Otherwise it didn't sound like a brass sound. Separate attack and decay functions for the different overtones. By manipulating that, Risset was able to make useful approximations to a lot of different instrumental timbres, and to extend the instrumental sounds so that you got interesting variations in the sounds of the instruments, which was what Risset was after. He wasn't trying to imitate instrumental sounds, but he wanted to get the same richness that the instruments had and vary it. Now, if one wants to individually modulate the attack and decay of a lot of components, it's a very expensive process for computationally. And in those days, the expense of the computer was significant. Chowning discovered a much more efficient way of modulating the attack and decay of the overtones. And this was a different application of frequency modulation, FM synthesis, than it was a different use of FM than anyone else had had. This was done essentially with just 2 oscillators, or a very few oscillators, and so it was a much more efficient technique computationally than Risset's technique, and it got to similar results of musical interest. And Chowning also was, in addition to being smart, was lucky in that his innovation of his discovery of the FM synthesis techniques came at just the time when complex computer chips were understood well enough so that it was feasible to design special purpose chips to do particular operations, i.e. in this case FM synthesis. In addition to his musical and technical talents, John has another talent. He's a super salesman, and he was able to convince the Yamaha company to spend several years and a lot of money and a lot of effort to design and test and redesign this FM chip. But when they had finished the design and when they had incorporated the chip into what I characterize it as their second generation synthesizer. And this real winner was the DX7 synthesizer. And the reason it was a winner was that it was very inexpensive compared to alternative means. I think the DX7 original cost was about $2,000 in 1980. The number of people making digital music, I would say, overnight increased from a few hundred worldwide to thousands, particularly in the domain of popular music. This almost overnight swept the United States and the rest of the world. As I say, Risset and Chowning, reading the science article, was the start of a very essential and important movement in computer music. Another early musician who was involved was Jim Tenney. And Tenney was a student of Larson Hiller at the University of Illinois. John Pierce visited Hiller and hired Jim Tenney to spend a couple of years at Bell Labs. And Hiller himself was interested in composing music with a computer program, which was also a big interest of John Pierce's. Now, it was not quite a significant interest for me. I was interested in having a computer perform music. Actually, the composing of music predated the performance of music with computers. I did do some experiments of my, let's say, own for computer-related compositions. Never with, I thought, great success, but with a certain amount of interest. But it was a much more difficult problem in terms of the logic of the program to produce it. Much harder problem, and that was one of the reasons why I shied away from trying to compose music on the computer. I felt that it was too difficult for me. I felt that one of the important problems in computer music was how to train musicians to use this new media and instrument. One procedure was to invite a small number, what we could, to come to Bell Labs for visits, maybe long visits like Jim Tenney or Jean-Claude Risset, or perhaps very short visits. But that was a relatively slow way of getting the media into as broad usage as we thought was appropriate. So one of the things that I did was to write a book which was essentially an instruction manual for how to use computer music. It's this book that came out in 1967, 1957, I guess. No, 67. The Technology of Computer Music. And it was really intended mostly as an instruction manual for how to use the Music 5 program. In 1967, The big computation center computers, or any digital computer that existed at that time, was not fast enough and powerful enough to make interesting music in real time. I've really missed the possibility of playing the computer as one would play a traditional instrument, so you could hear and modify the sounds and timbres and things you were making as you were as you made the music. The kind of thing that a performer is so expert at doing with traditional instruments. And furthermore, you couldn't really play in a musical ensemble where you played with other performers, and that to me has always been a great joy to relate to what other people are playing. I and F. Richard Moore, Dick Moore, who is now at the University of California at San Diego, put together what we call the groove system, and this was a hybrid system. The control end of the system was a digital computer, and the sound generating end was a modular analog synthesizer. Now, the analog sound wave synthesis has to be computed at audio sampling rates, which are now 44,000 samples per second. The control end of a digital system only has to be able to follow the motions of the performer who is controlling the music, and this requires sampling perhaps somewhere around 100 times per second. Dick and I put together a system with a small but fast analog digital computer at one end and connected a number of different sensors to the computer so that it could in real time track the motions or the changes that the performer was making in these sensors. And the output of the digital computer was a set, in this case 14 analog signals that were sent to an analog synthesizer that was had a lot of voltage controlled equipment. Controls that were available on the groove system consisted of a normal electric keyboard and a rather remarkable three-dimensional wand which you could move up and down, left and right, and back and forth, and potentiometers would record the position. But in addition to potentiometers controlling these three motions, there were motors on the device so that the computer could also move the wand, so that you could not only move it by hand, but you could feel the position of it or feel whatever the computer wanted you to feel, whatever the program you had written. And it was never very popular for one very good reason. It cost about $20,000 in 1960s dollars to build. So as far as I know, only one was ever built. But we did use this device to make quite a few pieces of music. One of those